Our Bible reading this morning is from John 13, verses 31 to 35. Therefore, when he had gone out, Jesus said, "Now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God is glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself, and will glorify him immediately. Little children, I am with you a little while longer. You will seek me, and as I said to the Jews, now I also say to you, where I am going, you cannot come. A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another, even as I have loved you, that you also love one another. By this, all men will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another."
Good morning. Well, it's the first Sunday of July, which means we are halfway through the year. And with the way that we have structured our sermon series this year, that means we are halfway through, well, obviously halfway through the subject that we want to cover, but we've covered two of the four quarters that we wanted to embark upon this year as we kind of take to heart our theme verse for the year. 1 John 4:16, God is love, and the one who abides in love abides in God, and God abides in him, is where we started this year, and we wanted to focus on that idea of love. And so we spent our first quarter, January, February, and March, we spent those 3 months talking about God's love for us, and really trying to plumb the depths of that subject, but understanding that really all that we did was just scratch the surface and begin to try to wrap our minds around a God that loves us. It's absurd. Why? Why does God love us? And it's got everything to do with him and really very little to do with us, other than the fact that he created us in his image and created us in order to love us. I mean, that's why he put us here. He put us here so that he could love us. And then after trying to understand that topic a little better, we moved on to the second quarter, which we just finished, which is our love for God. So again, I mean, in some form or in some way, it's kind of an absurd topic to think about. There's a God out there that created us along with everything else, and he loves us, but the idea that we then can reciprocate that love, that we can return that love, that we can give him back some kind of love that is meaningful in light of what he has done for us, really, it's hard to fathom, it's hard to understand, because he is God, and the love that he has demonstrated to us is so much farther beyond what we can imagine or what we can ever hope to attain to, that the idea that we're then going to try to emulate that or return that love to him really is beyond our ability. It's beyond what we can even fathom or think. But yet we spent a full quarter, 3 months, trying to wrap our minds around that very thing, trying to understand what it means for us to love God. And it's a hard subject. It seems like it should be an easy one, but it's a deep subject. It's a difficult subject, and one that we need to spend not just a quarter of a year studying, but really one that we need to pursue with zeal and fervor for the rest of our lives, one that we need to really try to comprehend, and that is loving God the way that we should. And so, having scratched the surface of those two topics, it's time to begin scratching at another topic, scratching at the surface of another topic, as we embark upon the third quarter for this year, and that is loving one another. And I feel like as we progress through the year, we kind of go from subjects that are maybe more abstract and more ethereal and more difficult to wrap our minds around, to ones that are a little more concrete, a little more familiar, and ones that maybe we feel like we can begin to approach doing justice to. Because if we're going to talk about love for one another, now we're moving out of the realm of a God that loves me more than I can imagine, and trying to return that love to a God that I can't even fully comprehend. And now I'm just talking about you people. And you guys are, well, I mean, we're kind of alike in a lot of ways, right? And so if the job is to love you and your job is to love me, well, I know I'm going to do it wrong sometimes and make mistakes, but so are you, and that's okay. We're kind of equals going at this with one another here. And so maybe as we move through this topic, we'll get into some more practical expressions of what love can look like and what love can be, and really kind of get to where I don't know what meme or idiom or whatever you want to use. We'll get to where the rubber meets the road, or where the nail hits the hammer. No, the hammer hits the nail on the head. Those kind of things, and we'll get into some more practical applications and practical lessons about really tangible things that we can do to express love. That's at least my hope, my goal, my desire as I move through these. But we've already seen through some of the past weeks that, sometimes what I plan on preaching is not what ends up being on the paper. Point in case for this morning, I switched the points around, so they're going to be out of order on your outline today. Same points, just a different order. So, new quarter, new topic. Here we go. We're going to start today with kind of introducing this idea, this topic of loving one another. And for the next 3 months, I want us to really not just play with this topic, not just kind of look at it from a distance and kind of see it in a nebulous way, but I really, my hope is that we can get into the center of this. We can get into the heart of this topic, and we can really look at what it means to love one another. We can really try to make application of that idea of I want to love you the way that Jesus taught me how to love you, and I want to see you loving one another the way that Jesus taught us how to love one another. And maybe we're there. Maybe it's just a refresher of things that we need to remember, and we need to put we need to just kind of freshen it up a little bit. But maybe there's some things that we need to completely change. Maybe there's some things that we need to do differently, or maybe there's some things that we are doing that we shouldn't be doing, or maybe there's some things that we aren't doing that we should be doing. And those are the ways that we need to love one another. And so that's the goal, the hope for this quarter, is that we can really delve into the depths of this topic of loving one another. So by way of introduction today, have you noticed that we've been spending a lot of time in John this year? I don't think it's a coincidence. First of all, our theme passage, our theme verse comes from 1 John, and when you realize that the letter 1 John was written by the same one who wrote the Gospel John, the fact that their subject matter overlaps so much is not a surprise. And so as we talk about love, it's natural that we would spend a lot of time in the Gospel of John and in the letters that John wrote, because he talks so much about love. And we are going to be doing that a lot this quarter as well. We'll be taking a lot of our lessons from the book of John and from the letters that John wrote. So if you want to do some reading or some work outside of class on the subject of love, those are a couple of great places to start. So our reading for today was from John chapter 13, and we've spent a lot of time talking about the context of the things going on in John, the last half of the book of John, from John chapter 13 all the way through chapter 17, and into the end of chapter 17, we had Jesus and his disciples in the upper room on the night of Jesus' betrayal, on the night of the Last Supper together. And so there's a significant chunk of text that is dedicated to the interaction that Jesus had with his disciples on the last night of his life before his crucifixion. And so it's almost a fourth of the whole gospel that John wrote is just this one discourse, just this one interaction between Jesus and his disciples or his apostles, as they are as he is preparing them for the fact that he is about to be crucified, and they are going to have to face life without him, because after his resurrection, his time there is very limited with them. And so in John chapter 13, this interaction begins with Jesus and his apostles, with them sitting down for the Last Supper together, and Jesus does something unusual in their minds. He gets up and he takes a basin of water and a towel, and he girds himself, and he goes around and he washes their feet before their meal together. And they're taken aback by this, even so far as that Peter says, "No, Lord, you won't wash my feet." And Jesus tells him, "Well, if I don't wash your feet, then you have no part with me." And then Peter wants to go further. "Well, then if that's a demonstration of me being united with you, just washing my feet, then wash my hands and my head too. And that will be an even greater demonstration of how united you and I are, or how dedicated I am to you and your mission." And so they have that interaction, and Jesus goes around and he washes all of the disciples' feet, and then he sits down and he begins teaching them, and he says, "You know, you really don't understand what I've done for you," which tells us it's not really about foot washing. It's not about the act itself. It's about what the act represents, or about what the act demonstrates to them. And then through this discourse, he talks to them about serving one another, and about humbling themselves, and about not thinking too highly of themselves. And then we have this interaction in the middle where Jesus reveals to them that he's about to be betrayed by one of them that's there with him. One of those that Jesus just washed his feet, by the way, is going to be the one that departs, that goes out of there and betrays Jesus. And so they have that interaction, and the disciples are very confused, because they don't understand how that could be. Who would do this? And then Jesus dismisses Judas to go, and what you are about to do it quickly. Go take care of what you need to do. And Judas leaves their presence. And even after that prediction, and even after Jesus tells him, "Go and do what you need to do," some of them still don't get it. And they think Jesus is just sending Judas to buy more supplies, or to give some money to the poor. And it's immediately after that departure of Judas that we have the text that was read for us this morning. And so it's within that context that Jesus has just dismissed Judas to go and betray him. Go and do this. Go and leave and sell me out so that I can be crucified. That we pick up in where we started this morning in verse 31. When he had gone out, Jesus said, "Now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him." If God is glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself, and will glorify him immediately. "Little children, I am with you a little while longer. You shall seek me. And as I said to the Jews, I now say to you also, where I am going, you cannot come. A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another, even as I have loved you, that you also love one another. By this all men will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." And so we're going to put all of this into context now, this command that Jesus gives, and the command to love one another is really where we need to start here. And ironically, I know Jesus says, "A new commandment I give you, to love one another." And I'm not going to argue with Jesus, but the command to love one another is not a new commandment. It's an old commandment. In fact, we can go all the way back to Leviticus 19, verse 18, and as a part of the Levitical code, as a part of the law of Moses, we have the words of Leviticus 19:18, "You shall not take vengeance, nor bear any grudge against the sons of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord." This commandment is at least 1,400 years old. Jesus says, love one another. It's a new commandment. And these men who are steeped in the law, who know the law, who have read the law, who have heard it preached their entire lives, have to be scratching their head and think, wait a minute, I know I've heard this before. It's not a new commandment to love one another. It is part of who we've been all along, that we are supposed to love one another. In fact, all through Jesus' ministry, we have accounts in the gospel of when Jesus is asked questions, and the answer to that question reveals the fact that loving one another is part of who they are as a nation. Matthew 22, verses 34 through 40. Matthew 22, beginning of verse 34, it says, "But when the Pharisees heard that he had put the Sadducees to silence, they gathered themselves together, and one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question, testing him. 'Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?' And he said to him, 'You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. That is the great and foremost commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend the whole law and the prophets.'" This is not a new teaching. This is the expected answer to that question. What's the greatest commandment? Well, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. That's Deuteronomy chapter 6. The second greatest commandment comes from Leviticus 19:18. By the time that Jesus is preaching and teaching and the Pharisees and the Sadducees are having their conflicts with one another, by this time this has been codified to the point where you could ask somebody, what's the number one commandment? And they would tell you, they would quote Deuteronomy chapter 6. And if you ask them what's the second greatest commandment, they would quote Leviticus 19:18. They knew the answers to those questions. The greatest commandment is to love God. The second greatest commandment is to love your neighbor. In fact, in Luke chapter 10, and I'm not going to give away too much here because we're going to get into Luke chapter 10 in a future lesson at length. But the beginning part of the story in Luke chapter 10, verse 25, says, "Behold, a certain lawyer stood up and put him to the test, saying, 'Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?' And Jesus said to him, 'What is written in the law? How do you read it?' And he answered and he said, 'You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself.'" Jesus was asked the same question in this instance, what is the greatest commandment? And Jesus turned it back around and he asked the man, "Well, what do you think the greatest commandment is?" And the man answered the same way that Jesus answered it. He quoted Deuteronomy 6 and he quoted Leviticus 19. He gave the answer that was expected. The first great commandment is love God. The second great commandment is love your neighbor. We know this. We can quote these things forwards and backwards. And we understand that we are supposed to love one another. But Jesus told his disciples, "A new commandment I give to you." It wasn't the love one another that was the new commandment. It's what follows. And so we need to think of things in this context or in this way. Jesus, yes, it's a new commandment. It's a new and improved. Do you ever buy something and then just a few weeks later you see you're in the store and now the same thing that you just bought has a new label and it says new and improved, and you feel like, oh, I got ripped off. I bought the old and useless, and now they got the new and improved, and so I've got to buy that thing again, right? And get the new one and see how much better it is. And Jesus here introduces the idea of a new and improved way of loving one another. See, keeping the law was hard. God knew it would be hard. That's kind of the reason that he set it up the way that he did, but keeping the law was hard. And so what do we as people naturally do when something is hard? Well, we look for shortcuts. We look for ways to make it easier. We look for ways to lower the bar, to lower the standard. And so we know we're supposed to love our neighbor. That's the second great commandment. But have you met my neighbor? I don't think you know what you're asking. And so we began looking for things like, what are the exceptions to this rule? When is it appropriate to not love my neighbor? When exactly do I owe this love to my neighbor? Who exactly is my neighbor? You say love one another. Well, Okay, but everybody? Really? I mean, there are people out there that aren't going to love me back. There are people out there who don't want my best interests at heart. There are people out there who'd like to do me harm. There are people out there who, if I love them, they're going to take advantage of me. And so I know you don't mean those people, obviously, because that would be too hard. But Jesus raises the bar. See, Jesus doesn't lower the bar. Sometimes people look at this idea that the law was too hard for us to keep. And so what Jesus did, he came in and he showed us an easier way of living so that we don't have to live up to the expectations of what the law was. But Jesus never did that. Jesus never lowered the bar. Jesus raises the bar. See, Jesus says to love one another as I have loved you, in the way that I have taught you to love, in the way that I have demonstrated love to be, and the things that I have done for others and have shown you how to do those things. I want you to love one another that way. What had Jesus just done for his apostles? He had just washed their feet. He was their Lord, their Master. He was their Rabbi. He was the Messiah. They had already confessed him to be the Son of God. And he took a towel and he washed their feet. And he got to Peter, and Peter said, no. And Jesus said, you have to let me love you. You have to let me demonstrate what love is if you want to be with me. And so Jesus washed his feet. And he came to the feet of a man named Judas, who Jesus knew was about to leave on those clean feet. He was about to walk out the door on those clean feet and go straight to the Jewish high council and sell him like a common slave. Jesus said, love one another as I have loved you. Let me show you the new and improved way of loving. And Jesus showed his disciples how to love. So what does it mean then, as I have loved you? And this is the what we're going to be getting into over the rest of this quarter to some extent. And so this is just the opening salvo here, just the opening few thoughts that we want to put into this. What does Jesus mean when he says, love one another as I have loved you? How did Jesus love? Well, he loved sacrificially. And when we think of sacrificing, we need to understand that it's not just giving something up. We stop there sometimes when we think of, I'm going to make this sacrifice, I'm going to give up something. See, sacrificing is not just giving something up, it's giving up something that matters. If it wasn't something that mattered to you in the first place, it wasn't a sacrifice. And so when Jesus shows love sacrificially, he gives up something that matters. He gave up his home in heaven. He gave up his throne. He gave up his title. He gave up his authority. He gave up things that mattered. And he came down here to show us how to love. And so when we love, we need to love sacrificially. And if our love doesn't cost us anything, then it doesn't mean anything. Jesus loved sacrificially. Jesus loved humbly. Jesus was willing. He voluntarily assigned himself a lower station so that others would be served. What had Jesus just done for his disciples? He had just washed their feet. He had taken the position of a house slave, of a house servant. And he had washed their feet. And that's part of why Peter refuses at first, because Peter recognizes that Jesus shouldn't be in this position. It's not right for the one who is of higher station to be washing the feet of those who are of lower station. But Jesus did it not because he had been compelled to, but because he volunteered to. He willingly did it. Jesus loved sacrificially and he loved humbly. And finally, here's a word for you. Jesus loved altruistically. Jesus loved even when he knew that love wouldn't be returned. Jesus loved even when he knew others would take advantage of him. Jesus loved even when he knew it would cost something. He washed Judas's feet. I can't get over that. I can't wrap my mind around the idea of washing the feet of the one that you knew was about to betray you to your death. Judas had no goodwill planned for Jesus. And yet Jesus loved him the same way that he loved the other 11. Jesus loved even when he knew that love would not be returned. So when Jesus says to his disciples, "A new command I give to you, that you love one another," if they stopped listening at that moment, they were probably thinking, like we were during the first point of this lesson, that's not a new command. We've heard this before, Jesus. But if they kept listening and they took to heart what Jesus said when he said, "Love one another as I have loved you," that puts everything into perspective. That helps them understand the lengths to which Jesus is calling them to love, the depth to which Jesus is calling them to love. And it helps them understand that this is not the same thing they've been hearing about all their lives. This is different. And Jesus goes on to say at the end of this interaction with his disciples, there in John 13, verse 35, he says, "By this all men will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." And remember, Jesus has just defined what that new and improved love is, hasn't he? Jesus has just defined that the love that I'm calling you to is not the same old love that you've been hearing about all your lives, not the love where the bar has been lowered and the standard has been reduced to make it easier to do. I'm calling you to love one another with that standard that I have set for you, that standard that's up here. And when people see you loving according to that standard, then they will know that you are my disciples. Because you didn't learn that from the world. You didn't learn that from anyone else. You learned that from me, because I'm the one that set that example. I'm the one that taught you how to do that. And any other love is counterfeit. Any other love is not the love that Christ teaches. Love that doesn't measure up to his standard is not his love. And by this you will know, all men will know that you are my disciples, if you have this love for one another. Jesus has been defining love differently all throughout his ministry. If you look at Matthew chapter 5, the Sermon on the Mount, we've talked about before, this is sort of Jesus' stump speech that he goes around from town to town, from village to village, from synagogue to synagogue, and he speaks, and it resembles this sermon almost every time that he speaks, especially during the early part of his ministry. And so he's teaching this lesson over and over and over again, and his disciples are hearing it over and over again. And it includes this teaching in Matthew chapter 5. Beginning in verse 43, it says, "You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor." There's Leviticus 19, by the way. That's a quote from Leviticus 19:18. You shall love your neighbor. And then here's the lowering of the bar. We know what the verse says. The verse says, love your neighbor, but that's too hard. And so we have set a new standard, and the rabbinical teaching was, you shall love your neighbor, but it's okay to hate your enemy. See, if we can define who our neighbor is, well, you love them, but I don't have to define everybody as being my neighbor. Some people are my enemy. It says love your neighbor. I don't have to love them if they're my enemy. You have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies. That's a new commandment. That's a new and improved form of love. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, in order that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven, for he causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. For if you love those who love you, what reward have you? Do not even the tax gatherers do the same? And if you greet your brothers only, what do you do more than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? Therefore, you are to be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. Do you see Jesus raising the bar? The bar had been lowered. It was down here. And Jesus says, if you love to this level where the bar has been lowered to, that doesn't mean anything. Anybody can do that. Anyone can do it, and people do it all the time. And when you love to that level, you know what that makes you? That makes you worldly. That makes you followers of the Gentiles, of the tax gatherers. That doesn't associate you with me. I put the bar up here. And when people see you loving at this level, when people see you loving your enemies, they will know that you're different. You're not of the world. And how did you get to be different? Because you followed my teaching. And when people see you doing that, they'll know you're my disciples. Jesus raises the standard for what love really is. And when we love that way, people will know that we're His. Love one another. That's what Jesus calls us to. But loving one another the way that He taught us how, that's what we really need to spend our time thinking about. The defining characteristic of a New Testament Christian should be our love for one another. That's what Jesus says. By this, by the way that you love one another, that's what will be what sets you apart from everyone else. And if we're set apart from everyone else, but we're set apart for different reasons, we got to wonder about those. But when we're set apart from everyone else because we love the way Jesus taught us how to love, then that should be what defines us as His people. So over the course of the next 12 weeks or so, we'll be delving into this idea of loving one another. But I don't want it to be superficial. I don't want it to be a lowering of the standards. I don't want it to be a shortcut or finding the easy way or a sermon that's 3 points on, the quickest route to love. Because that's not the love that Jesus demonstrated. That's not the love that Jesus taught. That's not the love that Jesus calls us to. Jesus raises the standard for what love is. And I want us to spend our time, our lives, reaching for that standard. If you have any need this morning that you'd like to bring before the congregation that we can help you with, if we can pray for you or pray with you, if we can help you in any way physically or spiritually, we want to know what that is. We want to demonstrate Christ's love to you. If you have any need, would you come while we stand and sing?